It was a bright, clear morning in the city, the kind of morning when people usually walked quickly to their jobs, coffee in hand, trying to shake off the last traces of sleep. Traffic was moving slowly on the main street, and the air smelled faintly of asphalt warmed by the sun. Among the cars winding their way through the lanes was a sleek black sedan, polished and well-kept, moving steadily with careful precision. Behind the wheel sat a woman in her 40s, composed and confident, with an air of calm authority about her. She had driven this route countless times, yet today, there was a sense that something was about to disturb the usual rhythm of her day. As she approached an intersection, she noticed a police cruiser parked just beyond the crosswalk, lights off for now but ready to act. She didn't think much of it. Routine stops were a normal part of city life, and she had never been a woman to cause unnecessary attention. She maintained her calm and continued driving. But then she saw the flashing lights behind her. The officer was signaling her to pull over. She took a deep breath and guided her car to the side of the road, carefully stopping without a moment of hesitation. She reached for her license and registration, already prepared for a polite and professional interaction. She knew her rights, she knew the rules, and she was calm enough to handle almost anything. What she didn't yet know was that the man about to approach her car carried assumptions she was about to dismantle. The officer was younger, maybe in his late 20s, with a clean-cut uniform and a posture that suggested authority, but also something more subtle, a hint of impatience in the way he stood. He walked toward the car with brisk steps, hand brushing near his belt, eyes narrowing as he looked at her. There was a moment, just a flicker, when he seemed to size her up, and in that moment he already thought he knew the story. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but carrying a subtle edge. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "Yes, officer," she replied, keeping her tone neutral and steady. "I assume it has something to do with my taillight. I noticed it might be dim this morning." The officer's eyes shifted slightly, scanning the car as if confirming his suspicion. "Yes, that's part of it. Your license plate light isn't working properly either. Can I see your license and registration, please?" She handed them over without hesitation, her hands steady on the dashboard. As he examined the documents, he seemed to take in more than just the papers. He looked at her face, her posture, the way she carried herself. Somewhere in his mind, assumptions began to take root. He didn't know why, but he felt a flicker of annoyance, a subtle irritation that was not entirely rational. "You live around here?" he asked, still scanning her papers. "Yes," she said calmly. "Just a few blocks from here." The officer paused for a second, then looked at her again, his expression unreadable. He seemed unsure how to continue, then spoke again. "Do you work in the city?" "I do," she replied. "I work for the police department, actually." She spoke plainly, letting the information settle without emphasis, expecting it might help smooth the interaction. The officer's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't show much reaction. "Oh, really? What's your role?" "I handle internal affairs investigations," she said plainly, her tone calm, even matter-of-fact. She didn't elaborate yet, just let the words sit in the air. For a moment, there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had heard the term, of course, but he didn't realize the gravity of it, nor did he realize how closely it applied to him. His mind raced, trying to process this without showing it. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to the window and kept his voice firm. "Well, ma'am, I need to make sure everything is in order. I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." She blinked, steadying herself. The request seemed unnecessary. There was no reason for her to step out. Her hands rested calmly on her lap. "Officer, may I ask why that's necessary?" The officer shifted slightly, as if uncertain how to answer. His tone hardened just a touch. "Just standard procedure. Step out, please." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not with anger but with measured awareness. She had been in situations like this many times before, but never personally targeted like this. She wasn't just anyone. The woman's mind worked quickly, weighing options, maintaining composure while assessing the man in front of her. She stepped out slowly, deliberately, maintaining a calm exterior while noting everything, the way he carried himself, the stiffness in his stance, the subtle tension in his jaw. As soon as she was out of the car, she noticed a small crowd had gathered nearby, commuters curious about the unfolding situation. Their faces carried interest, some concern. The officer didn't seem to notice the attention. His focus was entirely on her. "Hands where I can see them," he said, voice tight, as if trying to assert authority over someone clearly in control. She complied, not out of fear, but because she understood the importance of maintaining order and protecting herself in a situation that could escalate. Her mind, however, was alert and analyzing. She knew her authority and knowledge would change the dynamic as soon as she revealed it. For now, though, she had to navigate carefully. The officer began asking routine questions, but they were laced with subtle bias, assumptions about her demeanor and appearance. She answered each one carefully, neutral and factual, giving nothing that could be misinterpreted. All the while she noticed his impatience, the faint tightening of his grip on his belt, and the quick glances he gave her that betrayed a mixture of suspicion and discomfort. She could feel the tension rising. This was not a routine stop anymore. It was becoming personal, a reflection of his biases more than any actual violation. But she didn't show frustration or anger. Instead, she kept a calm exterior, thinking several steps ahead. She knew revealing her role too soon could escalate or humiliate him unnecessarily. But she also knew that letting him continue unchecked could be dangerous. "Do you have any idea why I might be asking these questions?" he finally demanded, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Yes, officer," she said, voice steady. "You are concerned about traffic violations, and I understand the need for enforcement. But I assure you everything else is in order." He frowned slightly, clearly trying to maintain control, as though his authority needed constant reinforcement. The power dynamic was delicate, though, and he didn't realize that the woman before him held a position of authority far beyond his rank. Her calm confidence was unsettling to him because it didn't match his expectation of fear or compliance. At this moment, she realized he was underestimating her, perhaps seeing her only through the lens of his own assumptions. It was a familiar feeling, and though it sparked irritation, it also gave her clarity. She could guide this encounter toward a safe and instructive resolution, without losing her composure or dignity. She stood quietly for a moment, assessing the surroundings, the bystanders, and the officer. Her mind mapped out the next steps, knowing that any sudden move could provoke him further. She decided to speak softly, firmly, and without emotion. "Officer," she began, "I understand your responsibility to enforce the law. I also want to make sure this interaction remains safe and professional for both of us." Her words were carefully chosen, not confrontational, but assertive enough to make him aware that she was not intimidated. He hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. For the first time, she noticed a subtle shift in his stance, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. This pause was crucial. It was the moment when the encounter could either escalate or begin to resolve. She allowed the silence to linger, letting him process, before preparing for the next step, one that would reveal the full truth of who she was, and turn the assumptions he held about her completely upside down. The officer's hand rested lightly on his belt. Though his knuckles were tight enough to betray his tension, he had stepped back slightly from the car as if creating a buffer between himself and the woman before him. And yet his gaze never left her. Something about her calm presence seemed to unnerve him. He wasn't used to people standing their ground like this, especially people who didn't fit the narrow expectations he carried in his mind. "You need to tell me why you're hesitating," he said, his voice sharper now, a little edge creeping in. "I'm asking questions and I expect straight answers." "I am answering," she said softly but firmly, her voice even and controlled. "I have already given you my license and registration. I have explained that my car is in working order except for the light you mentioned." The officer's eyes narrowed. There was something about her calmness that seemed like defiance, and he didn't like it. He was used to getting compliance, usually without much conversation, and this was different. It was frustrating in a way he hadn't expected. "Step aside," he said suddenly, motioning her toward the sidewalk. "I need to ask a few more questions." She paused for a moment, weighing her options. Her training had taught her to comply with routine requests as long as they didn't violate her rights or safety. She stepped slowly, deliberately toward the sidewalk. Her hands remained visible, calm, while she observed his movements carefully. She noticed the way his eyes flicked to her license again, as if confirming something. His body language was tense, defensive, ready to act without thinking fully. As she walked, a few pedestrians paused, watching the interaction. Some frowned, clearly uneasy at the way he spoke to her. Others whispered quietly to each other, curious about why an officer would be so insistent over such a minor traffic issue. She didn't mind their attention. In fact, she appreciated it. The more eyes on the situation, the less likely it was to spiral dangerously. "Ma'am, do you have any weapons on you?" he asked suddenly, his tone now sharper, almost accusatory. "No," she replied calmly, keeping her voice steady. "I am unarmed, and I am complying fully with your requests." He studied her for a moment, then shook his head slightly, almost unconsciously. "You seem calm, but your reactions, they don't make sense. Usually people are nervous in these situations." "I have been in similar situations before," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I know my rights, and I understand the importance of cooperating. I also expect officers to treat citizens with respect." The officer shifted uneasily. He had not expected her to speak so directly. Usually people either froze or offered nervous compliance. Her directness was disarming, and it forced him to adjust mid-thought. He was already feeling a twinge of frustration, the kind that comes when someone refuses to fit the narrative you have built in your mind. "Do you understand the seriousness of being stopped?" he asked. "I could issue a citation. This could go further if you don't answer my questions fully." "I understand," she said softly. Though her mind raced, she needed to keep him engaged but calm, to prevent the situation from escalating unnecessarily. She knew that showing any sign of fear or anger could provoke him further. "I am answering your questions truthfully, officer. That is the only way this interaction can remain professional and safe for both of us." He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. For a moment he seemed to struggle internally. There was the officer he wanted to be, the one in control, enforcing the rules. And then there was the tension he felt now, standing in front of someone who didn't react the way he expected. His assumptions about who she was and how she would behave were slowly crumbling. "Do you have any idea how you're supposed to act in a situation like this?" he asked, his voice a little tighter than before. "I believe I am acting exactly as I should," she said calmly. "I am cooperating fully, while ensuring that my rights and safety and yours are respected." The officer's frustration became more visible. He stepped closer, his movement slightly sharper, almost instinctive. "Do you think you can talk to me like that?" he demanded, his tone rising just a notch. "You need to understand that I am in charge here. I decide how this goes." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with measured curiosity. His posture and tone spoke of a need for authority, of fear hidden beneath a veneer of control. She kept her voice calm, letting him feel the weight of her presence. "I understand that you are performing your duty," she said. "I am simply asking that we treat this interaction professionally. That is the only way it can remain safe and lawful." For a few moments the two of them stood there, locked in a subtle power struggle, neither willing to yield immediately. Passers-by continued to glance, whispering among themselves, some frowning, some wide-eyed. She noticed one man with a briefcase slowing his steps, clearly watching the interaction unfold. It was as if the city itself had paused for this small but tense moment. Finally, the officer's voice cracked slightly, betraying his internal discomfort. "Why are you so calm?" "Most people get nervous, scared, or at least flustered. I am calm because I have no reason to panic," she said softly. "I am complying fully. I understand the law, and I trust that professionalism can guide this interaction." He blinked, momentarily taken aback. The words were simple, but they carried an authority he wasn't used to facing from someone in her position. His mind raced, trying to reconcile his assumptions with the reality before him. For the first time he hesitated, unsure of his next step. "Look," he said, forcing his tone to remain firm. "I just need to make sure everything is in order. That's all. Step aside, please, while I finish checking your information." She nodded, maintaining her calm composure. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and intentional. She noticed the small changes in his body language, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to her hands. He was nervous, though he would never admit it. And yet she still remained patient. She knew that a single wrong move from either of them could escalate the situation quickly. As he pulled out his radio to call in the details, she observed quietly. The officer spoke quickly, giving what she assumed were routine updates, but she could hear the slight strain in his voice. Even without realizing it, he had begun to second-guess his assumptions, his own confidence faltering. "You're sure your light is just a small issue?" he asked suddenly, glancing at her with an edge of doubt. "Yes," she said calmly. "It's minor, but I will have it repaired as soon as possible. I take responsibility for that." Her calm acceptance and willingness to cooperate seemed to confuse him further. His assumptions that she would be intimidated or apologetic were completely off. She was composed, knowledgeable, and fully aware of the law. That was something he hadn't accounted for. At that moment, she realized that this was the perfect time to prepare for the next step. She hadn't revealed her full identity yet, but she knew the right moment would soon present itself. The moment when his bias and assumptions could be addressed directly, without unnecessary escalation. "Officer," she said softly, "I hope you understand that I am not trying to undermine your authority. I am simply asking that we proceed professionally, as we both have responsibilities to uphold." He nodded stiffly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. His mind raced, trying to keep control while the reality of her calm, composed presence unsettled him. He had expected a different interaction, one where compliance was immediate and unquestioned. Instead, he found himself facing someone who didn't fit the narrow narrative he had in his head. The crowd of bystanders shifted slightly, sensing the tension in the air. Some muttered quietly, others exchanged glances. She noticed the subtle awareness building around her, and it gave her confidence. She didn't need to raise her voice or act aggressively. Her presence, calm and assured, was already asserting authority. "Okay," he said finally, a little tighter than before. "Step over here and wait. I need to finish this." She complied, walking a few steps to the side, keeping her posture relaxed but alert. Her mind was calm, analytical, and patient. She knew exactly what she was doing. The officer was still in charge on the surface, but he was now reacting to her, not the other way around. The subtle power dynamic had shifted, even if he didn't yet realize it. As she waited, she noticed the flickers of doubt and nervousness on his face. She allowed a small, polite smile, not mocking, simply human, acknowledging the situation without inflaming it. He looked up at her briefly, uncertain how to proceed. For the first time, the interaction had moved beyond routine enforcement. It had become a lesson in assumptions, authority, and awareness. And in that moment, she knew the next step, the revelation of who she really was, would completely change the course of this encounter. But for now, she waited, calm, professional, and aware, letting the tension rise just enough to prepare him for the truth he didn't yet know. The tension between them had been quietly building for several minutes now, like an invisible thread stretching taut. The officer's face was a mixture of authority, confusion, and frustration. Every gesture he made seemed deliberate, meant to assert control, yet betrayed uncertainty. He was used to people reacting differently, usually with nervous compliance or polite submission. But she did not act like that. She stood tall, calm, collected, unshaken. That very calmness unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on why. "All right," he said finally, attempting to regain control. "I just need to finish this and make sure everything is in order." He glanced down at the papers in his hand, flipping through them as though the answers he sought were hidden within the folds of the document. "You understand, right? This is routine. Nothing serious if you cooperate." "Yes, officer," she replied smoothly. Her voice was steady, measured, neutral, but beneath it a quiet confidence simmered. She had waited for this moment, knowing exactly when to act. She didn't need to argue or raise her voice. She simply needed to let the truth emerge, and it would speak louder than any words could. The officer's focus wavered for a moment, caught between his desire to maintain authority and the creeping realization that something about her behavior didn't match the narrative he had built in his head. People rarely stood this calmly, so composed in front of him. Rarely looked him in the eye and answered with such precision. Something was off, and it made him nervous. "I need you to wait here," he said again, trying to sound firm. He gestured to the curb, an edge of tension in his posture. "Step over there while I run your information." She complied, moving slowly to the designated spot. Every step was deliberate, showing patience and poise. Her hands remained visible, relaxed, and yet purposeful. The officer stepped back as if giving himself room to breathe, while still holding on to what he thought was control. For a few moments, the world seemed to pause around them. Commuters on the street slowed slightly, exchanging whispered glances. A woman carrying a grocery bag stopped mid-step to watch. A man with a briefcase inched closer to see what was happening. The city's usual rhythm had shifted. The interaction, small and private at first, had now drawn quiet attention. Yet she did not seem concerned. Her calm presence drew respect from bystanders without her needing to say a word. Finally, she decided it was time. Her patience had carried her to the precise moment where the officer's assumptions would be challenged fully. She straightened her posture slightly, lifted her chin, and spoke clearly. Without hesitation. "Officer," she said, her tone polite but firm, "I think it's important you understand exactly who you are speaking to." He looked at her, puzzled, blinking as if the words didn't register immediately. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice slightly tense now. "I am not just a civilian being stopped for a traffic issue," she continued calmly. "I am the head of internal affairs for this department." For a split second, the officer froze. His body stiffened. His eyes widened and a faint flush spread across his face. The words hit him like a shockwave, shaking the assumptions he had relied on for minutes. Internal affairs. He knew the weight of that role, the power it carried, and yet he had stood there speaking to her in a tone that assumed she was just another driver, someone beneath scrutiny, someone he could assert authority over. "You, what?" he managed to say, his voice faltering. "You head of internal affairs?" "Yes," she said, maintaining her calm composure. "That means I am responsible for investigating officers, ensuring accountability, and maintaining the standards of this department. And right now I am observing your actions carefully." He blinked again, struggling to process the reality of the situation. The tightness in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders, the faint trembling of his hands. These were the first signs of panic. His internal narrative had collapsed. The assumptions he had made, the subtle bias that had guided his behavior, all now threatened to overwhelm him. I didn't know," he said finally, the words weak, barely audible. I thought—" "You assumed," she interrupted gently, not harshly, just matter-of-factly. "You assumed based on my appearance, my race, and the way I conducted myself. That assumption was incorrect. Completely incorrect." He swallowed hard, looking away briefly before glancing back. His mind raced, trying to justify his earlier actions, trying to find a way to regain control. But the truth was inescapable. He had misjudged her. He had acted on bias, not fact, and now the weight of that realization pressed down on him. Your internal affairs," he repeated, more to himself than to her. His voice carried disbelief, confusion, and a faint trace of fear. He had never experienced this before, being caught in a situation where his own assumptions were exposed so plainly. "Yes," she said softly. "And it's my responsibility to ensure officers uphold the law and the standards of this department. That includes interactions like this one. I am here to observe. But I also want to ensure that this encounter remains professional, safe, and respectful." The officer's hands twitched slightly at his sides. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to reach for his radio, to try to regain some sense of control, or to simply comply. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving a mix of fear, guilt, and embarrassment. You mean to say," he began, his voice faltering again, "all this time I was wrong?" "Yes," she said, her voice calm, composed, and unwavering. "You were wrong. Not because of the law, not because of your uniform, but because of the assumptions you allowed to guide your behavior. You assumed too much and acted too quickly. That's what internal affairs exists to correct." He swallowed hard, the words settling heavily on him. He had been certain he was in the right, certain that he had approached the situation with proper authority. And yet here he was, confronted by someone whose authority dwarfed his own in terms of oversight, someone who had observed his actions with clarity, someone who was calmly, firmly holding him accountable. The bystanders had begun to take notice more actively now. Whispers spread along the sidewalk. Some people looked shocked, some impressed. Yet she remained composed, the calm center in the storm. Her presence commanded respect, not through intimidation but through quiet authority and confidence. He stammered, finally lowering his gaze. I didn't mean anything." "I understand that you may not have intended harm," she said, her voice firm but fair. "But intention does not erase impact. Your actions reflected bias and they affected me. And they could have affected anyone in a similar position. That's why accountability is important. That's why internal affairs exists." He nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. He realized in that moment that he had a choice. He could respond defensively, argue, and make the situation worse. Or he could acknowledge his mistake, listen, and learn. The right choice was painfully clear, even if his pride struggled to follow it. I understand," he said finally, voice small. I see that now." "Good," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Acknowledging mistakes is the first step toward growth. The next step is ensuring that actions align with professionalism, respect, and accountability. That includes how officers interact with citizens and with each other. He nodded again, more steadily this time. The tension in his body lessened slightly, though a faint embarrassment lingered. He had faced authority before, but never in this way. Never from someone he had assumed he could treat with casual disregard. I apologize, he said finally, the words coming slowly but sincerely. I shouldn't have acted the way I did. I accept that, she replied, her voice calm and reassuring. The important thing is that you recognize it and adjust your behavior in the future. That is how change happens. That is how trust is built and maintained. For a long moment, they stood in silence. The traffic moved slowly around them, the city continuing its routine, unaware of the small but significant encounter unfolding on the sidewalk. She could feel the officer processing, reflecting, realizing that the authority he had assumed was not absolute, and that bias could blind even those with the badge. Finally, she straightened fully, her posture signaling the shift from observation to resolution. You may return to your duties now, she said. But remember this encounter, and remember the responsibility that comes with authority. Actions matter. Words matter. Assumptions matter. Use your role wisely. He nodded, swallowing hard, visibly humbled. The encounter had changed him, even if just slightly. The lesson was clear. Authority must be paired with awareness, and respect must guide every action. And with that, she returned to her car, her movements calm and deliberate, leaving the officer to reflect on the encounter he would not soon forget. After the revelation, the officer stood frozen for a few moments, trying to collect his thoughts. He could feel a rush of emotions, embarrassment, guilt, even fear, coursing through him all at once. His confidence had vanished, replaced by the heavy weight of realizing that his behavior had been both biased and inappropriate. He knew the encounter was serious, and he also understood that the woman standing calmly before him, the head of internal affairs, had the power to hold him fully accountable. He looked at her, expecting some harsh reprimand or outburst. But she remained calm, her posture straight, her voice steady. She had not shouted, nor had she expressed anger. Her authority did not come from force or intimidation. It came from presence, from clarity, and from the undeniable truth of her position. Her calmness was almost more intimidating than any raised voice could be. You understand why your actions were problematic, don't you? She asked gently yet firmly. There was no sarcasm in her tone, only a clear demand for reflection and acknowledgement. The officer nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, he said, his voice low. I see now that I acted based on assumptions. I didn't think clearly, and I let my bias influence my actions. Good, she replied. Acknowledging mistakes is important, but acknowledgement alone is not enough. Actions must follow acknowledgement. That is why internal affairs exists, to ensure accountability and maintain trust within the department and with the public. He looked down at the ground, feeling a pang of shame. He had assumed authority came simply with a badge and uniform, but now he understood that responsibility was much deeper than that. It was about fairness, awareness, and integrity. The lesson was stark, unavoidable, and deeply personal. I need to report this incident, she continued, her tone calm and professional. I will document everything that happened here, including your actions, your responses, and your overall conduct. There will be a formal review. He nodded again, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. The idea of a formal review filled him with anxiety. He had never faced such scrutiny in this way, and yet he also knew it was justified. He had acted poorly, and now he had to accept the consequences. You will be required to provide a full account of the interaction, she said. Honesty is essential. Any attempt to misrepresent the facts will only worsen the situation. I understand, he said, his voice more steady now, though still heavy with apprehension. I will tell the truth. Everything I did, everything I said, I will report accurately. She nodded approvingly. Good, that is the right approach. Accountability begins with honesty. It continues with reflection, learning, and adjusting behavior going forward. The officer's mind raced. He had been confident, almost arrogantly so, at the beginning of this encounter. Now he was humbled. The authority he had relied on was no longer enough. He realized that trust, respect, and professionalism could not be assumed. They had to be earned and maintained constantly. You will also undergo training, she said, her voice steady but firm. Training on bias, communication, and professional conduct. This is not optional. It is part of the department's commitment to accountability and improvement. You must engage with it fully and sincerely. He nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on him. Yes, I will participate fully. I understand the importance. Good, she said, her tone calm and final. This is not about punishment alone. It is about learning, growth, and ensuring that such behavior does not occur again. It is also about maintaining the integrity of our department and the trust of the public we serve. For a moment, the street felt quieter. The pedestrians who had been watching the interaction had moved on, resuming their routines. The city's normal rhythm returned, but the encounter had left a mark on both of them. She had delivered the message with clarity, authority, and dignity. He had received it, humbled, aware, and now forced to confront his own failings. You may return to your duties, she said, her tone calm. But remember what happened here today. Let it guide your actions in the future. Authority without awareness is dangerous. Responsibility without integrity is empty. Let these lessons remain with you. The officer took a deep breath and straightened slightly. I will remember. Thank you, he said, the words sincere and unguarded. There was no pretense, no attempt to justify his actions. For the first time, he faced his mistakes fully, without evasion. She nodded, then turned back to her car. Every movement was composed, purposeful, and deliberate. She had handled the encounter professionally from start to finish. There was no anger, no bitterness, only authority, calm, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As she drove away, the officer watched her leave, a profound sense of humility settling over him. He knew this incident would remain with him for a long time, shaping the way he approached his duties, his interactions with citizens, and his understanding of bias and authority. Later, in the department office, the formal review took place. The officer recounted the incident honestly, detailing his behavior, his assumptions, and his missteps. Internal Affairs examined the report carefully, noting both his acknowledgement and his willingness to accept training and guidance. The review was thorough, fair, and transparent, emphasizing learning over punishment but holding him fully accountable. During the review, the officer reflected deeply on what had occurred. He realized that assumptions about people, about situations, and about authority could lead to serious consequences. He understood that bias, whether conscious or unconscious, could damage trust, relationships, and reputations. He also recognized the value of calm professional authority and the importance of treating every individual with respect and fairness. The department made a formal note of the incident in his record, requiring him to complete additional training and participate in workshops designed to address bias, professionalism, and effective communication. He accepted the requirements without argument, understanding that they were necessary steps for growth and improvement. The incident also sparked conversations within the department. Officers discussed the importance of awareness, professionalism, and accountability. The story spread quietly among colleagues, serving as a reminder of the responsibilities that came with the uniform. While some were shocked, most took the lesson seriously, recognizing the need for ongoing reflection and improvement. The woman, meanwhile, returned to her usual duties with the same calm professionalism that had defined her career. She handled cases, reviewed reports, and ensured accountability within the department. Her reputation remained untarnished, strengthened by the way she had managed a potentially volatile encounter with composure, authority, and fairness. In her office, she reflected briefly on the morning's events. It had been a test of patience, judgment, and skill. She had seen bias in action, addressed it calmly, and ensured accountability without escalation. It was a reminder of why her role existed and why vigilance and fairness were essential in maintaining trust within the department and the community. The officer, for his part, carried the lesson with him every day. He approached his duties with greater care, awareness, and humility. He learned to pause, reflect, and recognize the humanity in every person he encountered. He understood that authority was not about control or assumptions, but about responsibility, respect, and integrity. Over time, the incident became a quiet example within the department, a story not of punishment, but of accountability, growth, and professionalism. It demonstrated that even mistakes could be transformed into lessons, and that true authority came from fairness, calmness, and respect for others. For the woman, it was simply another day in her work, another instance where she upheld justice, fairness, and professionalism. For the officer, it was a turning point, a moment that reshaped his understanding of responsibility, bias, and human interaction. For the department, it was a reminder that integrity must guide every action, and that accountability is not a burden, but a cornerstone of trust. The city continued around them, busy and bustling, unaware of the small but significant encounter that had taken place. But for those involved, the impact was lasting. The lesson was clear, the reflection deep, and the commitment to improvement ongoing. In the end, the encounter demonstrated something simple but profound. Respect, fairness, and professionalism are not abstract ideals. They are active responsibilities that must be upheld every day. And when mistakes occur, acknowledgement, reflection, and corrective action are not only necessary, they are transformative. The city had returned to its usual rhythm, with people rushing to work, buses honking in the distance, and street vendors calling out their daily specials. But for the officer involved in the morning's incident, nothing would feel quite the same again. The events of that day had left an impression that went far beyond the traffic stop itself. Every step he took, every decision he made afterward, carried the quiet weight of reflection. He arrived at the station early the next morning, determined to show that he had truly learned from the encounter. The memory of her calm authority and clear words replayed in his mind. He could still see her standing there, unshaken, confident, observing his every move without aggression. She had commanded respect not by force but by presence, and that presence had changed him. His first task of the day was paperwork, and as he sat at his desk, he considered how he had treated her. He realized that his assumptions, based on her race and appearance, had clouded his judgment. He had acted in a way that was unprofessional, biased, and ultimately harmful. The acknowledgement of that truth was uncomfortable but necessary. It was the beginning of growth, and he understood that there was no shortcut to learning this lesson. Across the department, word of the incident had spread quietly but firmly. Officers whispered to one another in the hallways, discussing what had happened and reflecting on their own conduct. Some admitted to having assumptions or biases of their own that they hadn't recognized before. Others felt a renewed sense of respect for the woman who had handled the situation with such professionalism. She had turned what could have been a dangerous encounter into a teaching moment, showing that authority is not about force but about integrity and calm judgment. The officer himself attended the mandatory training sessions that had been assigned after the review. The workshops focused on bias awareness, effective communication, and professionalism in the field. At first he felt resistant, embarrassed, and defensive. But as the sessions progressed, he began to understand the depth of the issues they were addressing. He saw examples of behavior similar to his own, patterns of assumptions that could harm both citizens and colleagues. Slowly, he began to internalize the lessons, realizing that every interaction mattered and that respect had to be deliberate, not assumed. Meanwhile, the woman continued her work without fanfare. She reviewed cases, handled reports, and ensured accountability across the department. Yet in quiet moments, she reflected on the morning's events. She knew how easily things could have gone wrong if she had not maintained her composure. She understood that bias could be subtle but dangerous, and she was determined to use her position to guide the department toward fairness, professionalism, and respect. One afternoon, the officer approached her quietly in the hall. His posture was tentative, his voice careful. "I want to thank you," he said, "for the other day, for the way you handled everything. I've been reflecting, and I realize now how wrong I was. I want to do better." She looked at him calmly, nodding slightly. "Acknowledgement is important," she said, "but actions are what truly matter. It's encouraging to hear that you're reflecting, and I hope you continue to carry that awareness into every interaction you have moving forward."